CASA was submitted, and you might remember it from last year's closing. And this is a really interesting one to look at. So here's the before. And the people who use this they get so much work done in it. But there's a lot going on. There are a lot of colors and sizes. And so we did just a quick visual makeover on it, just to reduce the amount of color and to bring some common sizes. One of the most interesting things that came out of this was actually a question about those tabs. Some people took a look at the makeover and said, wow, but look at all the space you're losing because of those tabs, right? Those tabs are so big. We could fit so much more on that screen. And yeah, you could fit more on the screen. And I see a lot of solutions that are really dense, and I know customers ask for that. They want to see all their information all at once. But I want you to understand something really important about that. Fitts law is a way to describe how you can target something on a screen. And it has to do with the distance from your pointer, and it has to do with the size of the target. And this also translates not just to where it is on screen, but think about how it's going to feel to you when you're on a Mac. If you want to go to the file system, you can just kind of throw your mouse up to the top and it's going to hit the edge, right? So that's less mechanical effort that you have to put forth. Now think about trying to move your cursor to a small target and one that might be very close to the one next to it, and think about how much more just tension in your muscles it's going to take to actually manipulate the mouse there. I mean, same thing can go for an iPad or an iPhone, right? If you can just kind of go pull it and hit something versus, right? So when we looked at this, this is the spacious version. So I'm going to switch to layout mode and just go through. So here's the original. Let me see if I can get this fitting on the screen here. Come on. Might have to zoom it in. Hold on a sec here. All right, we'll look at it this way. Can you still see it all right? Yeah, okay. So here's the original, and that's 48 pixels high, or points high. And then just reduce a little bit of the, change the type to all caps, and we'll have a talk about that in a second. And then change the color scheme, but we've kept the size the same. But now this is increasing it just a little bit to 56 points, increasing it to 65, increasing it to 74. So that was the difference. Okay, so we could argue, we could say maybe the one in the middle is the one that we want to go with. Maybe the biggest one was a little too big, too spacious. But there were, the difference of 10 to 20 pixels, and how many lines is that? One, maybe two. And so what you're gaining in the number of lines you can put on the screen, you're losing in your user's ability to actually interact with what's on screen. So it's a really important trade-off you have to make. So consider that. In this example, a couple people asked me about, isn't it a best practice to not use all caps? Isn't it harder to read all caps? That is true. However, when you're building a navigation system, that's something that people are going to use over and over again. And really what you're getting at is this rhythm of targeting where the individual letter shapes are maybe not quite as important as kind of it's on the left side or the right side. The all caps are actually giving you a slightly stronger target to point at. And so while you might lose a fraction of a second in being able to read the word, you're probably gaining that fraction of a second back in targeting the tab. So it's just something to consider. Okay, so we're going to go into some case studies. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the process that we used, because it's a bit of an abbreviated process, but something that's at the core of the problem-solving process that I hope you can apply. So I interviewed the developers, and then to understand, what are the users doing, what are the business goals of the system, what are the things you're most interested in, what are the problems, just get a sense of what the solution was about. Mapped it and wireframed it, and then applied visual design to it. And what we got from that were the user profiles and the top tasks, and a decision grid, which is a tool I'm going to talk about in a second that I hope you can use, the system structure and the content hierarchy, and the visual design is in support of all of that. Okay, so we're going to start with the Full City Aqua Technologies solution, which you all saw twice in the keynote and probably have seen a little bit more throughout this week. So here are the befores. This was the synchronization screen. And this was the screen where most of the activity happens. This is where the guy is standing in the swamp or standing next to the pond and taking a picture of it and recording what treatment, what he's seeing, and then putting the treatments in. And there are some supporting screens, just kind of showing these. We did all of them. I won't show you all of them, but just some supporting screens that go along with this. And so the scan line is one of the first things we look at. And this is literally, if I had to read this whole page in order of the way it's laid out or the way that I'm supposed to be using it, what is your eye path through this? But another thing that's really important to think about when you do this is that the user of this is probably not filling this whole form out all at once, right? And so in this case, he's getting to a site and filling out that top chunk, and then he's probably walking somewhere, and then he's starting up the iPad again and entering the water body and maybe taking a picture of that. Then he's going to stand there and he's actually going to do some testing. So he's going to come back in. And so it's not just how are your eyes going to read this page all at once, but how are you moving in and out of this system, and what are you going to have to target when you come back? And are there clear chunks of information that are going to help draw your eye, or that you can kind of remember, well, it's at the top or the middle or the bottom, and you can easily find it. So the tap targets in this one, what we noticed was that they were pretty tight, right? And so this is the 44-point finger tap zone. And you can see that some of the buttons, like the top ones, are pretty clear. A couple of the fields are pretty tight, although in this case it's probably not going to be too problematic because you can tap kind of above the site name, and then you'll probably be tabbing or nexting into that next field. But the send button versus the down a row in that portal, that's kind of a problem. And then the checkboxes are pretty tight, and they're going to be tough to tap individually. The squint test is, people laugh at this, but it's a trick. You squint your eyes, and you can get a sense of where the dark spots are, and which things jump out at you and which things fall back. And that gives you an understanding of what's most important on this page, or is something jumping out at me that doesn't need to be. Okay, so here's the decision grid. So if I had to abbreviate what's some of the information that I get from the interviews and thinking through the system, and what are some of the decisions visually that I'm going to make, this is the grid that would describe that, right? So in interviewing the developer, learning, the water treatment text and fairly low text value, that's the who. They're going to be in the field in daylight. They're going to be beside water. It's one site at a time, not a bunch of sites all at once. The iPads, and this was a really important discovery, because if you look at let's just go back for a second here. If you look at this, you can see that it was actually optimized for the lowest common denominator, right? That looks like the information is going to fit whether the iPad is in portrait or in landscape mode. But without asking that in context, I said, how do the texts hold? How are they carrying these things? Are they setting them down and typing into them? And she said, no. Without a doubt, they're holding them under their arm like a clipboard, which says to me that portrait, 99% of the time, is going to be optimal for that experience. And so I'm going to design it for that. And then I'll take a look at what happens in landscape and make sure we can handle it. But there's no reason to make the experience, to detract from the experience that's only going to happen 1% of the time. And then the top tasks, because understanding if I had to stack rank the things people do, I need to make sure that the interface is in support of those first, and then start to build the other things around it. So the who, we decided simple, minimal, and watercolors, whatever that means, and we'll talk about that. We knew we had to have good contrast and large tap zones, and the service form, the actual entry of the service form was going to be the kind of the heavy areas of activity. And portrait optimized, primarily for iOS in this particular solution. So okay, the system app, and that's something that I'll do on a whiteboard or an OmniGraffle. Could be Post-it notes. It doesn't matter, but that's something I always step away from the computer or use something on the computer that just abstracts it for me. And this gives you a sense of how many screens and which screens are similar to which other ones, and those start to give you clues as to which common elements am I going to use from screen to screen, which ones need to stand on their own, maybe be different. Is something an overview or something a detail view? These are all things that you'll start to map out at this level of fidelity. All right, so now we're going to talk about wireframes. And this, I think, is really, really, really important, which is don't sit down and wireframe in FileMaker, because you'll get caught on details that you shouldn't be thinking about at this point in time. The tool that I use is called Balsamiq. You can use something like Visio, or OmniGraffle works well too. But here I'm going to show you it's kind of a play zone, right? And one of the reasons I like this is that I can work in the actual font size that I'm going to be using. And I can just type little blocks of, I know there's going to be a site name, and I know there's going to be a date. I'm not giving it specific data, although sometimes I know that the sites tend to be kind of long names, and so I'm going to remember that that's going to be long. And so the workflow in this case was, I decided to go with the golden ratio, but kind of because I wanted a heavy column and a narrow column. And then the second block here was, I knew that there was going to be something about the site, and I knew there was going to be something about the water body on that site, and I knew there was going to be some treatment stuff, right? So chunks of information. And then I actually went through and just kind of, I kind of went from the original solution and made a block for each of the fields on it, and I just kind of started juggling them around. It's a little bit like Tetris, right? But doing things like long fields are all long fields, and short fields are all short fields. And here's a chunk that's this many fields high. Is there another chunk that matches that? And do they go together topically, right? So you can start to play with it in a lot of different ways. And as you can see here, I mean, this was like maybe an hour of playing around with this, but it was looking at different structures on the page of pieces of information to see which one started to actually read, which one had me go, okay, site, okay, what about our information? Okay, treatment time. Like there were things that we were looking at here. So I'm gonna go back here and what we did from that point was, okay, so I've got the main activity page chunked out. And I've somehow managed to fit all the fields on it that I need to, which in this case was, I mean, there were a lot of fields that needed to fit, and somehow managed to fit them on. Now, if we had gone over, if there had been overflow, the first question would have been, do all those fields really need to be here? And is there any way that I can take a section of those and actually move them to a deeper level of the hierarchy? Am I really going to be entering all these things at once? And one of the questions here was, so I'm at a site, and the site might have multiple water bodies. And so I might be entering the water body information a couple of times. Should I maybe have a list of those water bodies and navigate into a deeper level? The way we answered that was to find out, generally speaking, how many sites do have multiple water bodies. And of all the sites, it was a very low percentage. Maybe 3% of them had multiple. And so we said, okay, so we're going to optimize for the people who have to go out and they're going to just do one water body, and we're going to leave it at the top. And then for the people who had multiple, we're just going to let them scroll. Okay, we're going to talk about grids. You've probably heard about grid systems. We did some work in FileMaker Pro 12 to give you a little more flexibility in the grid. And ultimately, pages should be laid out on a grid. It's an organizing system that keeps you from having to ask the question of where should this thing go, how wide should it be, what should it line up with. Page by page, you can have a very granular grid, or you can have kind of big chunking grid. And I'm going to show you something that I kind of discovered after the fact here. Let's see. Go to this one, and let me make sure you can see the whole thing. All right, that should be good. Okay, so here we are in layout mode, and I'm gonna turn the inspector on here, and I am going to go to this grid section. Now, by default, I believe this is, 72 major spaces and 8 minor steps, and that comes from background in print. One of the cool things we realized is that, we knew we wanted to give you more granularity in the grid. So let's turn on the screen stencil, since this is going to be an iPad, it's going to be portrait. Those are the dimensions. And so if I want to set up a grid based on 768, if I put that into my major grid spacing, this might seem a little weird, but go with me. So I put that width in the major grid spacing, and if I want to find the midpoint, if I divide that by 2, oops, I should probably turn it on so you can see it. Can you see those on the screen? They're very light. No? Okay, hold on. Let me see if I can make this better. There we go. Better? Okay. So let me go back here. All right, so if I want to find the middle, there's the middle, right? I divided it twice. If I want to find thirds, I divide it 3 times. If I want to find quarters, I divide it 4 times. That's a quick way to do it. Now, if you do a little bit of math, or if you use my cheater solution, which is in the updates for the session, it just so happens that I divide this by 32. I get this really nice block that's 24 by 24, which works really nicely with the 12-point font. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that if I really quickly want to figure out what might the chunks of my screen look like, well, I say, okay, I'm going to leave one block on both edges. And if I wanted to have some sort of header area, it might be like that. And then let's see, I'm going to put a block space between. And I'm going to move this over here. Oh, okay, so if I want those to be if I want them to have 24 in between, I'm actually going to bump up the spacing to, to 64, quick math by a designer, right? So you can really quickly build a chunk of how your layout might work, right? And so if you start going here, I'm like, well, okay, what if I actually want to have kind of like a narrow column and I want to have a wide column? There you go. So really quickly, you can see how you might use this to chunk out how your solution might work. Yay.